Mrs. Twit. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She didn't have a hairy face, of course, but it was a pity, because that at any rate would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Take a look at her. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face? I doubt it. But the funny thing is, Mrs. Twit wasn't born ugly. She had quite a nice face when she was younger. The ugliness had grown upon her year after year. Why would that happen? Well, I will tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on that face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts can never be ugly. You can have a wonky nose, crooked mouth, a double chin and sticky out teeth, but if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams and you will always look lovely. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand she carried a walking stick. She used to tell people that this was because she had warts growing on the soles of her feet and walking was painful. But the real reason she carried a stick was so that she could hit things with it. Things like dogs and cats and small children. Then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. The glass eye. You can play a lot of tricks with a glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in any time you like, and you can bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all the tricks. One morning she took out her glass eye and she dropped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit sat there drinking the beer slowly. The froth made white ring on the hairs around his mouth. He wiped the froth on the sleeve of his coat and wiped his sleeve on his trousers. "You're plotting something," Mrs. Twit said, keeping her back turned so he wouldn't see that she had taken out her glass eye. "Whenever you go all quiet like that, I know very well that you are plotting something." Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think up a really nasty trick that he could play on his wife. "You better be careful," Mrs. Twit said, "because when I see you starting to plot, I watch you like a wombat." "Oh, do shut up," Mr. Twit said. He kept on drinking his beer, his evil mind working away at the latest horrid trick that he could play on the old woman. Suddenly, Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat. He caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eye staring back up at him from the bottom of his mug. It made him jump. "I told you I was watching you," cackled Mrs. Twit. "I've got eyes everywhere, so you better be careful." The frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. Yeah, as you do. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between the sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and she climbed into her head and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was always itching. Dirty old women like her always have itchy tummies. Then all at once she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed, "Ah! What's the matter with you?" said Mr. Twit. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed." "I bet it's that giant skillywiggler I saw earlier on the floor," Mr. Twit said. "The what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. I tried to kill it, but it got away, Mr. Twit said. It's got teeth like screwdrivers. Help! Screamed Mrs. Twit. Save me! It's all over my feet. It'll bite off your toes, said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a cold jug of water. He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near to the water. It started jumping about on her pillow, because we all know that frogs love water. This one was having a great time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped on her face. Now, this is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. And she screamed again. By golly, it is a giant skiddly wiggler, Mr. Twit said. It'll bite off your nose. Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on her sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow.